Something extraordinary happened in Davos. Not behind closed doors, not in a leaked memo, not in a quiet diplomatic backchannel. It happened on the main stage of the World Economic Forum, in front of the world's political and economic elite. Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, stood up and did something no Western leader has dared to do so openly in years. He didn't just criticize American policy. He didn't just hint at concerns or disagreements. He declared in clear and carefully chosen words that the entire system that has governed the Western world since 1945 is breaking, and that the United States is now at the center of that fracture. And then he went even further. He said Canada stands with Greenland and Denmark against American pressure. He reaffirmed Canada's absolute commitment to NATO's Article 5, even if that means standing against the United States itself. And he warned that the era where America could dominate through economic pressure, tariffs, financial infrastructure, and supply chain coercion is coming to an end. In diplomatic language, this is seismic. In geopolitical reality, this is a declaration that the Western alliance is no longer operating on autopilot. Carney's speech was not emotional. It was not theatrical. It was surgical, calm, precise, and devastating. He began by addressing the Arctic, a region that has quietly become one of the most strategic battlegrounds on Earth. Greenland is no longer just a frozen island. It is a critical node for rare earth minerals, military positioning, early warning radar systems, and control over future Arctic shipping routes. The United States has made no secret of its interest in Greenland in recent years. But Carney made something very clear. Canada stands firmly with Greenland and Denmark and fully supports their right to determine their own future. Canada's commitment to NATO's Article 5, he said, is unwavering. That sentence carries a hidden meaning that everyone in the room understood. Article 5 is the clause that says an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all. If the United States were to use force or coercion against Greenland, Canada would not stay neutral. It would not stay silent. It would be on the opposite side. Then Carney listed what Canada is doing about it. Massive investments in over-the-horizon radar, submarines, aircraft, and troops deployed in the Arctic. Boots on the ground, boots on the ice. That wasn't a metaphor. That was a message. This is not posturing. This is preparation. But the Arctic was only the surface layer of the speech. The real target was the global system itself and America's role in it. Carney looked straight at the core myth that has governed the West for decades, the so-called rules-based international order. He said what most leaders only whisper privately. He said that this order was always partially a fiction, that the strongest countries exempted themselves when it suited them, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically, that international law applied differently depending on who the accused or the victim was. But, he said, that fiction used to serve a purpose. American hegemony, for all its flaws, provided public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and frameworks for resolving disputes. So everyone played along. Everyone put the sign in the window. Everyone participated in the rituals. Everyone pretended. And now? This bargain no longer works, Carney said. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. That single sentence is one of the most important geopolitical statements made by any Western leader in the past decade. A transition means continuity. A rupture means the system is breaking. He explained why. Over the past 20 years, crises in finance, health, energy, and geopolitics have exposed the dangers of extreme global integration. But more recently, great powers, and he was clearly including the United States, have started using that integration as a weapon, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as pressure points. This is not cooperation. This is economic warfare. And here is the line that landed like a bomb in the room. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination. In other words, globalization is no longer a shared project. It is now a tool of dominance. He then turned to the institutions that were supposed to manage the world, the WTO, the UN, the KOP system. He said their very architecture is under threat, and because of that, countries are drawing the same conclusion. They must develop strategic autonomy in energy, food, critical minerals, finance, and supply chains. When the rules no longer protect you, you must protect yourself. But Carney also warned what that leads to: a world of fortresses, poorer, more fragile, less sustainable. And then he delivered another warning that was clearly aimed at Washington. Hegemons cannot continually monetize their relationships. Allies will diversify, they will hedge, they will build insurance. They will rebuild sovereignty not on rules, but on the ability to withstand pressure. This is not theory. This is already happening. Canada, he said, is no longer relying on the strength of its values alone, but on the value of its strength. Taxes cut, internal trade barriers removed, $1 trillion fast-tracked into energy, AI, critical minerals and trade corridors. Defense spending doubled. Strategic partnerships signed across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. New agreements with China and Qatar. Trade negotiations with India, ASEAN, and South America. This is not a country aligning more closely with the United States. This is a country preparing for a world where the United States is no longer the center of gravity. And that is what makes this speech so dangerous and so historic. Because this wasn't just Canada speaking. This was the voice of the middle powers saying something out loud for the first time. The old order is over. And America is no longer the unquestioned leader of what comes next. What made Mark Carney's Davos speech truly dangerous wasn't just what he said about the United States. It was what he said about everyone else. Because buried inside his calm technocratic language was a message that should terrify every empire in history. The middle powers are done pretending. They are done performing sovereignty while living in dependence. They are done competing with each other for scraps of favor from a hegemon that now uses pressure instead of leadership. Carney framed the entire moment using an idea borrowed from Václav Havel, the Czech dissident who described how authoritarian systems survive not only through force, but through ritualized participation in a lie. The shopkeeper who puts the slogan in the window doesn't believe it. Nobody believes it. But everyone keeps playing along because it is safer than telling the truth. The system survives because people act as if it is real. For decades, Carney argued that is exactly how the so-called rules-based international order functioned. Countries like Canada participated in its institutions, praised its principles, and benefited from its predictability, even while knowing that the system was rigged. The strongest players broke the rules when it suited them. Trade enforcement was selective. International law was inconsistent. But the system delivered enough stability, enough growth, and enough protection to make the lie worth maintaining. That era is over. What Carney called the rupture is not just about tariffs or trade wars. It is about trust collapsing at the center of the system. It is about economic integration turning from a source of shared prosperity into a mechanism of control. When access to the dollar system becomes a weapon. When supply chains become hostages. When financial infrastructure becomes a tool of coercion. At that point, integration is no longer cooperation. It is subordination. And when subordination becomes visible, it becomes intolerable. This is why Carney's speech resonated so strongly in Davos. Because he was saying out loud what leaders from Europe to Asia to the global south have been quietly concluding for years. Depending on a single dominant power is now a strategic vulnerability. He described the new reflex spreading across the world. Countries are racing to secure energy independence, food security, critical minerals, domestic industry, financial autonomy. Not because they want to break the global system, but because the global system is no longer neutral. And then he delivered the brutal truth that most politicians avoid. When the rules no longer protect you, you must protect yourself. This is the psychological turning point of a new era. But Carney did not present this as a heroic nationalist revival. In fact, he warned that a world of fortresses would be poorer, more fragile, and less sustainable. Total self-sufficiency is inefficient. Redundant systems are expensive. Fragmented standards slow innovation. Everyone building their own walls is a losing strategy. So what is the alternative? Here is where the speech becomes truly subversive. Carney argued that middle powers, countries that are not empires but not insignificant, must stop negotiating alone. Because when a middle power negotiates bilaterally with a hegemon, it negotiates from weakness. It accepts the terms offered. It competes with other middle powers to be the most accommodating. This, he said, is not sovereignty. It is the performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination. That is an extraordinary statement. In other words, the old model, Washington in the center, everyone else orbiting around it, no longer works for those in the middle. The only way to regain leverage is to combine weight, to create coalitions, to build parallel structures, to negotiate as blocs rather than as supplicants. This is exactly what Canada is now doing. Carney laid out a strategy that is far more ambitious than most people realize. Canada is not just diversifying trade. It is actively helping to build a new geometry of global power, a strategic partnership with the European Union, integration into European defense procurement structures, 12 new trade and security agreements in 6 months across 4 continents, new strategic partnerships with China and Qatar, active negotiations with India, ASEAN, and South America. At the same time, Canada is pushing to build bridges between major trade blocs, between the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the European Union, to create a combined market of 1.5 billion people. That is not a technical trade adjustment. That is the foundation of a parallel economic center of gravity. On critical minerals, Canada is pushing buyer clubs anchored in the G7 to break concentrated supply chains. On AI, it is coordinating with like-minded democracies to avoid being forced to choose between technological empires. This is not multilateralism in the old sense. This is not about universal institutions that include everyone and enforce nothing. This is about flexible coalitions, issue by issue, sector by sector, a dense web of overlapping partnerships that reduces dependence on any single power. And here is the line that should worry Washington the most. If we're not at the table, we're on the menu. That is not anti-American rhetoric. That is survival logic. Carney acknowledged that great powers can still, for now, afford to go it alone. They have market size. They have military power. They have leverage. Middle powers do not. But together, they can create something else. A third path. Not American, not Chinese, not imperial, but networked. And this is the real meaning of what happened in Davos. This was not Canada complaining. This was Canada recruiting Europe, recruiting Asia, recruiting every country that feels the ground shifting under its feet and knows that the old guarantees no longer hold. The era of quiet dependency is ending. The era of organized, coordinated middle power resistance to domination is just beginning. And the United States is about to discover what it feels like to negotiate in a world where it is no longer the only pole that matters. There is a sentence in Mark Carney's Davos speech that should be studied in Washington very carefully. We are no longer just relying on the strength of our values, but also the value of our strength. That is not rhetorical decoration. That is a declaration of strategic independence. For decades, Canada's role in the Western system was predictable. Close ally, reliable partner, junior pillar of the American-led order, prosperous, stable, but ultimately sheltered by geography and by US power. That era is over, and Carney said it openly. Canada's old comfortable assumptions that its location and its alliances automatically guaranteed prosperity and security are no longer valid. So what replaces them? Not neutrality, not submission, not isolation, preparation. Carney laid out a transformation that most outside observers have not fully processed. Canada is rearming, reindustrializing, and rewiring its economy at the same time. Defense spending is being doubled by the end of the decade, not just to buy equipment, but to rebuild domestic defense industries. Over-the-horizon radar, submarines, aircraft, Arctic deployment capabilities. This is not symbolic. This is about controlling territory, especially in the north, where strategic competition is accelerating. Boots on the ground, boots on the ice. That phrase is doing a lot of work. It means Canada is no longer assuming that the Arctic will remain a low-tension, cooperative space. It means Canada is preparing for scenarios that would have been unthinkable a decade ago, including direct strategic friction with the United States over Greenland, shipping routes, and Arctic security architecture. But the military shift is only one layer. At home, Carney described something even more radical: the dismantling of internal trade barriers between Canadian provinces, the fast-tracking of $1 trillion in investment into energy, artificial intelligence, critical minerals, and new trade corridors. This is industrial policy at wartime speed, justified not by ideology, but by vulnerability. The logic is simple and brutal. A country that cannot feed itself, fuel itself, or defend itself has no real sovereignty. Canada is also using its financial firepower. Its pension funds are among the largest and most sophisticated in the world. Its government still has massive fiscal capacity. It is using both to anchor long-term strategic investments instead of relying on foreign capital flows that can be weaponized. And then there is the external strategy. Canada is no longer organizing its foreign policy around one central relationship. It is building redundancy, optionality, insurance. Carney listed what is already happening: a comprehensive strategic partnership with the European Union, including integration into European defense procurement. New strategic partnerships with China and Qatar, a cascade of trade and security agreements across 4 continents, active negotiations with India, ASEAN, Thailand, the Philippines, and South America. This is not hedging. This is decentering. It means that if Washington applies pressure, Canada has alternatives. If supply chains are disrupted, Canada has options. If financial channels are threatened, Canada has roots. This is exactly what Carney meant when he said sovereignty will increasingly be anchored not in rules, but in the ability to withstand pressure. And this is where the speech crosses from analysis into quiet confrontation, because this entire architecture is being built around a single unspoken assumption: that the United States is no longer a reliably benign anchor of the system. Carney never had to say it directly. Everyone in Davos understood. He also made something else clear: Canada is not trying to replace one hegemon with another. This is not about choosing China over the United States. In fact, he explicitly said Canada is working to avoid being forced to choose between hegemons and hyperscalers. This is about building enough collective weight among middle powers that no single giant can dictate terms. On Ukraine, Canada is part of the core coalition. On Arctic sovereignty, it stands with Greenland and Denmark. On trade, it is trying to fuse major blocs. On critical minerals, it is building coordinated buyer groups. On AI, it is coordinating standards with like-minded states. This is what he called variable geometry: different coalitions for different issues based on shared interests and values, not universal membership and endless paralysis. It is a fundamentally different model of global governance. Not centralized, not hierarchical, networked. And this is what makes the speech so destabilizing to the old order. Because the old order only works if everyone keeps pretending it still works. Carney explicitly rejected that. He said it is time to stop invoking the rules-based international order as if it still functions as advertised. Call it what it is, a system of intensifying great power rivalry, where economic integration is used as coercion. He said middle powers must apply the same standards to allies and rivals. No more selective outrage. No more keeping the sign in the window. And then he said something that should be read as a direct warning to Washington. When middle powers criticize coercion from one direction but stay silent when it comes from another, they are participating in the lie that sustains the system. Canada, he said, is done with that. This is not a dramatic rupture. There will be no press conference announcing a break. There will be no formal declaration of independence from the American sphere. Instead, there will be something far more dangerous for a hegemon. Slow, methodical irreversibility. Every new trade corridor, every new defense procurement network, every new energy partnership, every new financial channel reduces American leverage a little more. And once leverage is gone, so is dominance. The United States may still be the most powerful country in the world, but power is no longer enough when the system itself is being quietly rewired to function without you at the center. Canada is no longer hiding inside the old order. It is preparing for the world after it.